Hi guys. So like I said before, we'll just start with opening statements, 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll just jump into a few questions that we've gotten from our readers over the last week as we've advertised this.
Great.
So Matt will start with you on opening statements, and then we'll also start with you on questions that you're the first to respond.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having this forum. I think it's really important for your readers and your audience just to understand what this ballot question is all about. My name is Matt Wilder, and I'm the communications consultant for the Yes on 3 campaign. We are advocating for voters to uphold this law that protects transgender people from discrimination in all public places. So any place that's at work, home, or school, restaurants, movie theaters, retail shops, medical offices, you name it, any place that the public is generally welcome. This law covers transgender people from discrimination. It was passed 2 years ago by Governor Baker and an overwhelming majority of the legislature, and has been really on the books now for 2 years without incident, and has really gone to set the tone, I think, for the state that we are an inclusive place that welcomes transgender people and is, honors them as members of our community. I think you'll hear a lot, and perhaps your readers have heard a lot from the No campaign about incidents of criminal activity in places. And quite frankly, there just isn't a connection to this law. And so what we know is that there is no correlation between criminal activity and these non-discrimination laws. There's been a peer-reviewed study out of the Williams Institute at UCLA Law School that proves that. What this law does is protect dignity and respect for transgender people, and that's what we're asking everyone to vote yes on 3 on Election Day.
Great.
Thanks. So my name is Andrew Beckwith. I am the legal analyst for the No on 3 campaign. And I think we could all agree that everyone deserves to feel comfortable and safe in public restrooms, locker rooms, showers, changing facilities, and the like. And that includes women who may be uncomfortable, for example, with males or male bodies in those women's spaces. And unfortunately, what this law tells them is that they really have no right to object. It says that any man at any time can enter any of these private women's spaces if that individual claims to identify as a male. In fact, a registered sex offender could even go in and claim to be a female and enter women's spaces. And the legislature, when they passed this bill, for example, had an opportunity to add an amendment that would have prohibited level 2 and 3 registered sex offenders from making use of this law, and they refused to do so. So we need to allow women to be able to speak up for what makes them uncomfortable in these facilities, and that's why I'm voting no on question 3.
Great. Okay, so Matt, we'll start with you. First, I want our readers to understand, why for transgender people being able to use a bathroom that doesn't necessarily identify with their birth, gender, or sex is so important for them. And then kind of to keep it broad just to begin with, out of bathrooms just a little bit, of how common is it for transgender people to be discriminated against in public accommodations? Is this law 100% necessary? Is that something they deal with a lot?
Sure. And I want to first make note of something that Andrew said, which I think is really important. That we should allow women to speak up and talk about why this law is so important. They have. More than 50 of the state's leading sexual assault prevention agencies are endorsing our campaign. That includes survivors of sexual assault who have come out and have said this law does not make them any less safe. So I would really turn that question on Andrew. Andrew, if you're advocating for women to speak up, why aren't the leading sexual assault prevention agencies in the state? Why aren't the law enforcement leaders, chiefs of police across the state endorsing your campaign?
Well,
I would like to stick to the questions right now, and then we can kind of get into more of a debate style. I wanted to keep it, I just have 3 questions for each side that I think kind of put down a base background, and then we can kind of get a little more into
sure.
Yeah.
Well, let me talk directly to your question then.
Okay.
So I think the reason it's so important, when we talk about restrooms, and restrooms are just a tiny piece of the area of law that is protected, that this law protects. Think about this for a moment. Put yourself in the shoes of a transgender person. You go out to a restaurant with your family or friends, and you can't use the restroom there. You go to a movie and you can't use the restroom. Think about just how many times you use the restroom in a given day. Having the ability to access those points is really the ability to live a public life and go out into the general public. And so that part of it is really important, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is about much more than just restrooms and locker rooms. It's about any place that the public is generally welcome. This law prevents discrimination and harassment in those places. So I think that it's really important to remember that this law that's on the ballot doesn't repeal just restroom protections. It repeals every protection. And that's really important, I think, for people to know. And I think there was a second part to your question.
How common is it for transgender people to be discriminated against in not just restrooms, but
very common. In fact, a survey not too long ago by Fenway Health showed that transgender people experience discrimination somewhere in the north of 70% in their daily lives. This is very, very real. These are people who are often marginalized in our society, who need the protections of the law that have been in place now for 2 years here in Massachusetts, and quite frankly much longer in Boston, where it's been on the books for over a decade without incident.
Would you like to respond, and then we'll ask you a
Sure.
question.
I mean, just quickly, so yes, a law like this was on the books in Boston for, I think, well over a decade, or about a decade, and in 2009, there was a women's shelter in Boston where a biological male who identified as female went into the women's bathroom in that women's shelter. And the real women who were in that shelter, many of whom were probably victims of domestic abuse or violence at the hands of men, were uncomfortable with that male body in their bathroom. And they asked for him to leave, he refused, so they finally got the police, and the police forced him to leave. But then he turned around and sued the shelter and the city and won on both counts, I think $20,000 to $30,000 in settlement, because under the law that was in place at Boston at that time, which is similar to what's in place across the Commonwealth right now, that man had a right to be in the women's bathroom at a women's shelter, and it didn't matter that those women were uncomfortable with complaining about it. And that's part of the problem as to why we need to repeal this law. And the reason why we focus on the bathrooms, one, because there's a real safety and privacy concern there, but also because all the other areas, whether it's being in a restaurant or a hospital or a park, those areas of public accommodation law are already covered by the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. They put out a letter to legislators in 2015 when we were debating this bill that said they interpret the existing sex discrimination laws to cover gender identity. And they've actually adjudicated cases of gender identity in public accommodation. The only area that this law changes, and that would change if we repealed it back, are the bathrooms, locker room, showers, and the like.
I think the shelter incident that Andrew brings up is really important to set the context for that a bit. Andrew's right, a settlement was reached for $20,000 with the city of Boston because the city and the police department admitted that they broke their own policies in that interaction with that transgender woman. And I just have to say, Andrew, the rhetoric around real women is really offensive to transgender people across this state who very much are real women. And I think that kind of language can really hurt young people who are really exploring their own youth and trying to find out who they are. And so I just want to set the tone there. That can be really harmful to transgender youth across the state.
What I think is harmful is dismissing the concerns of all the other women who are in that homeless shelter. So what do you say to them? Because
I would turn to the
they
experts.
didn't want that male body in there.
I would turn to the experts.
I
would
don't
turn
think
to
they
the
need experts.
experts.
If they're uncomfortable,
their
voices should be heard. They're the most marginalized in our community,
and
their voices were silenced.
I would turn to the sexual assault prevention agencies, Jane Doe. I don't think they would support a law that puts women at risk. They are fully supportive of Yes on 3. They have been. That's why the chiefs of police across the state are supportive of Yes on 3 and upholding this law, because they know that it makes our communities safer.
Well, the experts may like it, but it silences the victims. That's the problem.
The victims.
So I have a question kind of about this, and I think I can ask both sides. So if this person tries to take advantage of this law, someone who shouldn't be there, what enforcement is possible when it is not necessarily a crime? It's just making someone uncomfortable isn't necessarily a crime, but it does, it makes people uncomfortable, even if it's not sexual assault. What kind of enforcement exists there, and what would we'll start with Andrew on the answer, what would you like to see for that?
Well, that's that dangerous gray area. Before this law is in place, if a man goes into a woman's restroom, locker room, changing area, the woman knows immediately, okay, this is a problem. And they know that if they complain, steps will be taken. For example, up at the Y in Beverly, a few years ago, there was a man who entered into the women's locker room. The women complained. Management told him he could not use the women's locker room. They have to work something else out. If that same man were to go into that same women's locker room today, the management would be prevented by this law from taking any action. And if they did keep him from going into the women's locker room to protect their privacy and safety, they would face upwards of $50,000 in fines, $10,000 for the first offense, $25,000 for the second, $50,000 for the third, and potentially a year in jail. So again, that's what the statute says. This law prevents women from making those complaints early on. It essentially says you can look but not touch. So if a man goes into a women's locker room and commits a sexual assault, yes, that's still a crime. But all the way up to the point where he's touching someone or taking a picture, he has a right to be there. In fact, in Woburn, at a Target in Woburn last week, there was a man who went into the women's bathroom with a 10-year-old girl was in there. Asked her if she wants some candy and tried to get into her stall. She comes out, tells her mom. The mom calls the police. The police identify him on security footage. But when they question him, he said he identified as transgender, and so they're dropping the charges. But that 10-year-old girl was at risk. It's because of this law.
So first of all, it's just not true that someone can loiter in a public locker room and it be permissible under this law. The Attorney General's office has released guidance that says explicitly that that is an improper use under this law. So that would be an opportunity for someone to speak up and call law enforcement or tell the management of the organization that or the company that the business that they're in, and action would be taken. And that's totally appropriate under this law. In terms of the Woburn case, I think it's really important to point out that was reported by one news organization. We called that news organization, and they told us they had to retract that story because after further comments with the police, they found out that the police had said there actually was no crime committed. It was a misunderstanding, and Fox 25 themselves retracted the story, which is not a small feat for a news organization to do. So I think that just puts into context that story.
Have you spoken to the parents?
I think
because I have. I'm telling you, there was no misunderstanding.
We've spoken to the police who are investigating.
So
excuse me, the news organization has spoken to the police that are investigating, and they said that there was a misunderstanding and that the incident was not a criminal activity. So I take the word of the news organization which reported it and the police who talked to them. Again, but let's make the point of what Andrew is trying to do. He's trying to scare voters with what ifs and what could happen. Let's look at the facts of what has happened the last 2 years. There has been no increase in public safety incidents in these spaces. A study from the Williams Institute at UCLA Law School shows that there is no correlation between non-discrimination protections and criminal activity in these spaces. Law enforcement across the state have said that this law makes our communities safer. These are the chiefs of police in every community across the state are saying this. Sexual assault prevention agencies, again, they would not support a law that puts women at risk, and quite frankly, neither would I.
Again, I've spoken to the dad, okay, and there was no misunderstanding. So you can talk to Fox 25.
Well, you talked about the police report. Let's talk about what the police are saying.
Do you have a copy of the police report?
Have you spoken to the police?
Yes, and they said it was an ongoing investigation. We spoke to them earlier. We spoke.
So why did Fox 25 retract the story?
You have to ask them.
We did.
Great to have them.
We did.
On record
they said it was a misunderstanding.
Because that's what the police said. But I'm telling you, the father said it was not a misunderstanding because he's spoken to his daughter and he believes his daughter. That's exactly the problem with this law. Is it allows this guy, because he claims to be transgender, and who knows what his gender identity is. It doesn't matter to the 10-year-old girl what his gender identity is. She knows that there was a man, a male body, in that bathroom who was trying to get into the stall while she was in there.
And if that were happening, that would be
threatened.
illegal, and the police would arrest the person.
Well, they didn't. Because of this law, because he has a right to be in there because of how he claims to identify. Just like Debbie Mascio, who is a level 2 convicted sex offender who identifies as female, but has about a dozen different aliases. There's an anatomical male named Paul Charbonneau. He identifies as Debbie Mascio. He was arrested for trespassing at Merrimack College. He's got a lengthy history of exposing himself and sexually assaulting children. Some of his aliases are female, which means he could use the women's bathroom, locker room, shower, changing room, anywhere in the Commonwealth, and no one can do anything until he actually commits an assault or takes a picture.
He was arrested. The person was arrested.
Because there's no trespassing order at Merriman College, but he could come to the bathroom right down the hall here and use the women's restroom, and nothing could be done unless he actually touches someone and takes a picture.
Here's what the No on 3 campaign is trying to do, and I think it's really important for your viewers and audience to understand this. They are trying to connect transgender people with sex offenders. It's offensive and it's not true. The vast majority, excuse me if I could finish, I didn't interrupt you. I did not interrupt you, Andrew, if I could finish, please. The vast majority of transgender people, the overwhelming majority of transgender people, are good people who just want to live their lives with protections and freedoms that we all enjoy. And I think that we can all agree that that makes sense. Does it make any sense that someone who enters a space and tries to enter a stall would not be arrested? No, it doesn't. That would be a criminal act. It would be an improper use. Nothing about this law protects that person. I think that the police would have taken action in Woburn if they thought that that happened. I don't know. I wasn't there. You weren't there. The police, I am going to trust to do their job appropriately. They know the law, and I don't think that they would not take action if something happened.
The problem in Woburn is the police did their job under this law. It's the law's fault, not the police's fault, that 10-year-old girl is not protected.
That's
now,
not true.
well, now you're going to let me finish, right? Now, on the sex offender question, Paul Charbonneau is a level 3 convicted sex offender. He identifies sometimes, I don't know if it's all the time or not, because there's over a dozen aliases, as Debbie Mossia. If you Google it, folks at home, M-O-C-C-I-A, Debbie Mossia. None of his victims, I would warn, care how he identifies. But he can use that identity to exploit the law and
it's not true. If that woman were to go into a space and commit a crime, she would be arrested. Nothing about this law protects her.
So you're saying Paul Charbonneau is a woman?
I don't know that particular person, but if they identify as transgender, I'm going to honor that and say that if that person goes into a space, whether they're transgender or not, Andrew, and they commit a crime, they will be arrested, they will be prosecuted as they should be.
So we're going to move on to just our next question. So this one's for you. The concern is that the ill-intentioned would use this law as a bail. So you say that's not a problem. So let's say in the rare instance that it is, what can establishments do? You know, if this law stays and, you know, establishments are concerned about the things Andrew's concerned about, what can they do to kind of
So you're asking someone who's not transgender who may be trying to use the cover of this law to
if,
commit
you know,
a crime.
if this law is being used as a bail by the rare ill-intentioned that,
yeah.
you know,
well, first of all,
it does happen.
First of all, I would say that hasn't happened here in Massachusetts. So that's really important to point out. If it were to happen, the law is very clear. Actions can be taken. There's nothing in this law that protects people from committing crimes, whether they be transgender or not. The law is very clear that this law cannot be used for an improper use. So you cannot assert gender identity for an improper use. And if you do commit a crime or intend to commit a crime, you can be stopped and arrested and charged.
So if someone, you know, feels uncomfortable, they should just approach, you know, the establishment and.
Absolutely. I mean, it's common sense. We just need to approach this with common sense, which I think a lot of people probably do in their everyday. So if you feel like something's not right, of course say something to the establishment where you are. You're not going to be fined. It defies common logic to say that someone's going to be fined $50,000 for asking a question or reporting something to the police. You know, Andrew had the good opportunity to have a conversation with Representative Paul Tucker, who is a former police chief of the Salem Police Department, 32 years on the force. And he made a very good point the other night to say that the police are there to protect everyone 100% of the time. We don't carve out special populations of the community that we protect, and we don't carve out special populations of the community that we protect some of the time. And so if you report something to the police, they're going to help you see if a crime is committed, and if so, take action. And nothing has changed because of this law.
So just for the record, Reps Tucker's comments about not carving out certain people that aren't going to be protected was in the context of me asking him why he voted against the amendment to exempt registered sex offenders from this law. So he is apparently okay with Paul Charbonneau using a female identity to get into places that I think we all recognize he shouldn't be. But for example, I now know what Paul Charbonneau looks like. I've seen his picture in the papers, the Lawrence City Tribune earlier this week. If I'm at the local Y and I see him trying to go into the women's room while I'm waiting for my daughter to change over after swimming lessons, and I stand in between him and that door, I have now prevented him from gaining full access and enjoyment to a public accommodation. I would be liable for, on the first instance, $10,000 in fines and up to a year in jail. But it is not just about bathrooms. Let's talk about establishments. There was a beauty spa in Milton, Massachusetts that declined to give a Brazilian bikini wax, okay, Brazilian wax, you can Google it if you don't know what it is, to a man, anatomical male, who identified as female. And so he filed a claim with the Attorney General's office for discrimination in a public accommodation on the basis of his gender identity. Because he identified as a woman, and this spa, owned and operated by women, gives Brazilian bikini waxes to women, his claim was they denied to him for no other reason than that he was a transgender woman. Okay, and under the law, the way this works, he will win that case. And so women will be required to wax male genitals against their will or be fined $10,000 on the first incident. So that's another problem with this law, is that it forces women to do things they're not comfortable doing because this anatomical male identifies as a female.
Well, I would just first off say that to say that Paul Tucker is okay with sex offenders in the same sentence is laughable. He is someone with the most immense integrity. He served the police force in Salem for over 30 years, retired as chief, and anyone who knows his integrity would find that laughable. The truth of the matter is that the law does not carve out special populations of people. In fact, when that is done, quite frankly, it's been found to be unconstitutional. And so I think that what this law does is say that anyone who commits a crime in these spaces will be prosecuted, arrested, and be held accountable. In terms of the spa, let's set the record straight there, because there's elements of that story that the No on 3 campaign does not like to share. That woman, a transgender woman, was seeking services of a spa. She called up and asked what kind of services they offered. She created an appointment for a manicure pedicure and said, let's get to know each other. And over time, we become friendly with each other, and you can trust me and I trust you. We can see what other services you may be able to hold. And I know Andrew's going to mention that our campaign co-chair, Mason Dunn, was one of the people who helped file that complaint. And I'll say this, Mason, in his day job, is the executive director of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Caucus, is one of the organizations that is doing incredible work on behalf of the transgender community. And he is a man of incredible integrity as well. And all he did was refer that woman to the options available to her in seeking that complaint. The complaint, by the way, has since been withdrawn, and so therefore is no longer being processed by the Attorney General's office, which I know Andrew knows. So I think it's really important that there is a democratic process. There is a process by which if people feel they've been discriminated against, they can file complaints. That's what happened in that case. But the bigger point is that nothing about this law forces people to touch people who they don't want to touch, and that's true in this spot.
Let me just ask one quick follow-up question, because I'd like you to clarify this, Matt. So if a transgender woman goes to a spa that gives Brazilian waxes to women and is denied because the spa worker says, I'm sorry, you have male genitalia, we're not going to do that, is that discrimination?
Well, that's not what happened in this case.
Is that discrimination?
Well, here's what I would say. I would say
they
that...
don't want to answer the question.
No,
because they
could I answer the question? You're trying to cut me off. I'd like to answer the question.
Please answer it.
I would say that in this process, this woman was humiliated. And I think we can all agree that that shouldn't have happened. No one should be humiliated under this law.
The spa workers humiliated by what this woman said to them, describing his male genitalia and how it functions and doesn't function. That is obscene, and that spa owner, the woman in the spa has every right to deny service to someone who is talking to her like that. And you won't admit the fact that this law makes that person win.
Nothing about this law forces anyone to touch anyone they don't want to touch. That's ridiculous and defies common sense.
I think we just have two more questions, one that I had prepared and then one that we got from a viewer, and then I think we'll be all set. So I talked to Yvette a little bit for the last story that I worked on, and she talked about what you talked about, the amendment for sex offenders. So what is the No on 3's, what do you guys ultimately want? Besides repealing this law, she said basically to take the law back to the legislature and have it amended in some way. And what is that amendment? What are you guys seeking there?
Well, I mean, the way the repeal process works, we can't sort of fine-tune the law. It's kind of all or nothing. So at this point, we have to repeal the law. And as I've said before, the existing law, prior to this law being passed, protects instances of gender identity discrimination in public accommodations in every setting except the bathrooms and restrooms. And so when it's repealed, we're hopeful that the legislature will take its cues from this democratic process of hearing from the voters and construct some sort of paradigm that protects the privacy rights of everyone. unfortunately you have what seems like a zero-sum game, where you have someone whose body and identity don't align. Where did they go? I think realistically, most people would do what they've done prior to this, which is use the facility that makes the most sense for them. But what will change is that if someone is using the facility inappropriately, women won't be silenced. They'll have a right to quickly object, and that's what will be restored at this law review.
I would just say women are not silenced. Again, I want to reiterate this because I think it's very important. To discount the voices of the leading 50 sexual assault prevention agencies in the state, I think is pretty incredible. These are people who every day are working on behalf of women, survivors, families, in ways that to protect them, and in fact in ways that just other organizations aren't doing. And so to discount their voices, I think is pretty incredible. This law, I think Andrew makes a good point. If it is repealed, it repeals all protections for transgender people in all places of public accommodation. So that's any place the public is generally welcome. Andrew mentions MCAT and the guidelines that are there. The Attorney General has said quite forcefully that MCAT is a great department, great organization within the state government, but it does not.
Can you explain that for our
Yeah, sure. MCAT is the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, okay. And they are the ones that process complaints of discrimination. Okay. But they do not have the force of the law that the legislature passed 2 years ago, and would be reinforced in the courts if it were to get to that. So that is why this law is so important, to uphold these protections in all public places, not just restrooms and locker rooms.
And I think our last question, I thought was pretty good from one of our viewers, is in a perfect world, is the answer single stall bathrooms? Not having to deal with this, there are various states that have, Vermont just said that if you have a single stall bathroom, it needs to be labeled as gender neutral. And I don't think it's a law, but when I was in Providence, I noticed a lot of places just didn't have mass bathrooms. There were just single stall bathrooms, and they were labeled as whatever, because when you're in there alone, who cares what the bathroom's labeled as? Yeah. So will either side be pushing for that to be the next step at some point?
Well, we're certainly not advocating for that. I think that our goal is to make sure that transgender people are treated with dignity and respect everywhere they go, and we're not going to advocate for single stall bathrooms. However, I will say that a lot of establishments, as you point out, are already doing that. And it seems like a way a lot of businesses are, when they're building new spaces, are building those out that way, but it's certainly not, I think, a solution to this problem. There will always be spaces where that's just not possible, and so we need to make sure that transgender people have access to all those spaces that all of us take for granted, and are able to enjoy them just like you and I do.
My answer to that is sure. If there is a single stall facility, sometimes we're labeled a family, or either or because it's a single person, that probably makes the most sense for someone again whose body and identity aren't in alignment, because the male and female bathrooms are designed for male and female bodies, and so that's how their use should be regulated. That's the only way you can protect the privacy of everyone.
My camera person left me, so I have to stand up and turn this off.
All right.
But thank you both so much for coming in. We really appreciate it. And we'll write a story about what we talked about today for the Vermont paper.
Great. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah.